Awesome. Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you, everyone. I'm excited to talk a little bit about how we use some water quality data in Vermont, as well as some social resiliency indicators to really hone in on what towns we wanted to be doing some outreach in. And I wanted to start off a little bit about some unique demographics of the Green Mountain State here in Vermont. I think it's been mentioned, we are a very small state. One of the unique factors that we really needed to take into account is that we do have an older population. So our average population age is about 5 years older than the national average at 44. And about a quarter of the Vermont population is also over the age of 65. So definitely an aging state. Another thing is that you can kind of tell by looking at the population density map over there, largely rural. We really have one major city in Burlington, and I say a major city in quotes. We're about 44,000 there. And really everything at the state level is broken down by municipality. So we have 247 towns, and that's really where a lot of local government takes place. You'll see county breakdowns, those really exist just as map boundary layers. As you can imagine, with such a rural state that we do have a really large percentage of folks served by private drinking water sources, mostly drilled wells like you'll see there on the upper right corner. We use some CDC phone surveys to kind of get an idea of what the actual number of people using private water looks like in Vermont. It ranges quite a bit depending on how you ask. It is a difficult number to pin down, but they found somewhere between 45 upwards of 53% of folks in Vermont consume water from one of these private sources. I heard earlier in this week someone mention the USGS study that looked at the same thing. They came to a lower estimate. I think that's a little bit older data. But the thing that's been really consistent is that really we come second only to Maine in per capita private water usage. So even though we're a smaller state, definitely really heavily dependent on these private systems. Another thing we found from that breakfast survey that the CDC conducted, that we paid them to ask some of these questions, up to 50% of folks on private water systems have not tested them in Vermont. So that was definitely something really concerning to us, something that we wanted to address. We also knew from some internal chemistry data that 40% of sources that were tested exceeded a health standard, usually bacteria, but also a number of inorganics. And I would say probably the greatest tool that we have at our disposal really stems from some legislation that was passed in 2012 that really enabled us to collect water quality data from both public labs like our Vermont Department of Health Public Health Lab, as well as any lab that does drinking water testing in the state or is certified to do drinking water testing in the state. So we have 7 labs reporting to us now. It was a pretty long ramp up even after this was passed to actually be getting data in a format that was usable to us. As you can imagine, a lot of private labs weren't super keen to add this to their workload, but it was something that was required to be certified. So in the past year, we've really been able to ramp up this database, get a lot of historic data, both from our public health lab, our agency of ag lab, and private labs. So it's a really robust data set that we have access to. And once we had all of this data kind of compiled into a central database, it really enabled us to create a dashboard to really visualize what the water quality looked like statewide. And this really kind of had 3 goals. One was to visualize. 600,000 data points is a lot to sift through in an Excel file. So really to get a feel of what all of these different water quality parameters look like on a statewide level. The second goal of this dashboard and some of the maps that we created was really to inform Vermonters too. So like if you're in an area where there's increased levels of contamination, you'll have like a darker shade of blue. And really find any sort of contamination hotspots for things like naturally occurring inorganics. So here's an example of like our arsenic map. Kind of cool thing about it is it does update in real time. So as results are sent to us, this map will kind of fill in and change as we go on. In the case of this arsenic map, you can see I have a little red circle around 3 communities in part of our state that exceed 20% of their samples having arsenic above the MCL. That was definitely a concern that we had, was kind of seeing once this map was filled in. I think one of these communities had kind of been on our radar for a while, having like historic arsenic problems. But the two kind of adjacent to it really were not on our radar. So that was a surprising result. And that kind of started to inspire, if it's not on our radar, it's probably not on the radar of some of these small rural communities. The other thing we noticed is we started to look at different analytes. This is an example of gross alpha radiation testing. We definitely noticed that there was some blank spots in the map. So there was areas where we had kind of less than the threshold that we set of 20 samples. If we had less than 20 samples in any of the individual towns, we knew we didn't really have a statistical bearing to make any claims about, what the average level was. So what we realized is there was definitely some blind spots that we had. I think some of the things we thought about is they're, largely small rural communities. But there was also some things we knew, like these were kind of communities, far away from town centers. They lacked high-speed internet. But we definitely wanted to kind of fill in this picture more, and that was part of this outreach's goal, as we knew the testing rate in some areas was low, and we wanted to get a better feel for what the groundwater looked like there. So as we started kind of moving forward with this process, we knew we wanted to use as much of this water quality data as possible, really to identify towns that had, a lot of different water quality issues. So one of the things we did was kind of to create a single index that took into account, I think there was like 7 different analytes that we looked at, and really compile all those numbers into a single index that we could then rank and prioritize which towns we wanted to do outreach in first. The second piece that we wanted to take into account when we were looking at these towns was really ensuring that there was a lot of folks served by private water in those communities. So even though we are a rural town, a lot of folks use private water, we wanted to make sure that if we were going to do this town level outreach that, putting that effort in, that it was going to be helping a lot of people in those individual communities. And 2 sources of data we used to kind of come up with that number was looking at our well log database. So Vermont is unique that we have a lot of folks on springs and dug wells where we don't have a great idea of where those are located. But this well log database gave us an idea of where we know there is a lot of tagged wells. And we also use census data to help inform this. And ultimately, what that gave us was a pretty rough estimate of what the percentage in any community is that's reliant on private water. And ultimately, tying that back into our database, kind of new areas where we would expect the testing rate to be higher based off of those demographics. So we could kind of look at towns and say, hey, the testing rate's really low here, or this is a town that has, everybody is served by some sort of private well. And then the third factor we wanted to consider that was a little bit outside of kind of traditional data analysis was really to, thinking back of those white spaces, identify if there's any particular barriers that those communities might have that lowers their testing rate. We use some really great tools that are available in Vermont and other places that look at community resiliency, as well as different factors like access to vehicle services, high-speed internet, and really wanted to take those things into account to see if there were communities that might benefit from additional outreach based off of some of their demographics. And just to speak a little bit more about how we constructed the water quality index, I think this was something that we spent a lot of time on, so I wanted to talk about it a little bit more. But basically having this single index allowed us to look at all 247 municipalities kind of simultaneously. And rank them against each other and what the results looked like. The index involved similar to the maps, just the percentage of tests that were above the MCL, so that's a pretty straightforward calculation. But we also wanted to take into account the average concentration, and what this was for was really for communities that had something like arsenic. You could have a town, say, that had a lot of results that had detectable arsenic, but maybe we're not exceeding the MCL frequently, and we definitely wanted to take that into account. We also looked at the 95th percentile for each community. What this really enabled us to do was to kind of gauge how high results were. So say if 5% of uranium results were high in a community, but the level was 10, 20, 30 times over the MCL, we wanted to take that into account, as that those were communities where there was high levels, and put that into our ranking as well. So after a lot of number crunching, we kind of arrived at this top 10 list of sorts. This is kind of just a little bit of a summary showing where each community is, which health district they're located in, and I'll talk about why that's important. Next, you'll see like the water quality index with a lower number being worse. So you see those at the top. The population testing theme, this really took into account that percentage of private water users, whether we thought the testing rate was particularly low, again, lower being a worse number. And then we also had some notes in here that I thought were relevant. So like in the case of Westmore, we see that they're over double the highest radon in town. So one thing of having an index that takes into account this water quality is it does prioritize town that have concurrent water quality issues. So that one had multiple things kind of counting against it in this ranking. Westmore was also unique in that it was the highest percentage of folks served by private water by our estimates. So that definitely rose it to the top. To kind of contrast that in Wells, the main water quality concern was arsenic, but it was the worst in multiple ways of measuring it. So it had the most MCL exceedances and the highest means. So on average, it was the highest. Another significant thing was that it also had the lowest population of people with access to broadband internet. So that was something we wanted to take into account with our outreach. Another thing to note too, just about after we did this ranking, one thing that really jumped out at us is that 9 of the top 10 all fell within 2 health districts. So there definitely was a tight regional influence around where these towns are located and kind of what those water quality concerns were. So this was really helpful in kind of thinking about how we were going to work with community partners to develop this outreach and then utilize some of our regional health offices. So just to speak a little bit about how our health department is organized, we are a centralized model, so we don't have county health departments, anything like that. Our kind of equivalent branch is under the umbrella of the health department. We do have 12 local health offices. Those are really kind of the on-the-ground support for what we do as a state, so they're pretty well known in their community. They do things like flood response work, vaccine clinics. They are also the central point for delivering test results too. So after folks take a test, they'll deliver it back to there and then have that shipped back up to our central lab. So we knew in kind of modeling this, knowing that there was these 2 communities where these towns that we had identified really fell into, we knew we wanted to work with our Newport and Rutland offices to really be the kind of foothold into these communities and do some work with them. So we knew one thing we really wanted to do, and we'd heard this message before, is that in general, we kind of have a generic message that everybody in the state should test their private water for X, Y, and Z. We knew that this message resonated pretty well with some folks, but a lot of folks out in these rural communities, it's pretty easy to see that and say, oh, that's for someone else as well. That's not for me. I don't need to hear it. So what we really wanted to do was to develop fact sheets and information that was highlighting those individual towns that we were working in and call them out specifically. So that was something that we worked with our communications team on quite a bit. And then how we visualized this working was connecting with those health offices that serve those communities about kind of unique ways on how to get the message out and where to put the word out to reach these people, because they're much more closely tied to those communities than we would be. Also identifying some of those demographic things. We also wanted to supply a number of free need-based test kits to those communities at the local health offices for them to distribute kind of on a one-on-one as needed basis. And really this was in an effort to work with local health to find community partners that we could partner with to help be advocates for this message and to work with to kind of address some of the communication gaps that existed. So that was ultimately all to increase awareness about risk in these areas with the hope that it would increase testing, start to fill in those maps more and help people identify if they're in an area of concern or not. And then briefly, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how we put together the fact sheet. I think that was one of the bigger lifts, was really trying to make communication materials that were accessible to a wide audience and really what message to include in there. Our communications team was really helpful, and we did a lot of back and forth work with these communities and people there kind of to see what information is most important for them. So the first thing was definitely making sure it's plain language, it can be understood by a really wide group of folks. Using headings, I think this was kind of a unique thing. I think I definitely fall victim of I would love to make a 5-page document, make it really comprehensive and use a lot of technical terms. So I think it was a really iterative process to get this down to kind of a small digestible form. One piece of information that we thought was really helpful was the use of images to help convey a meaning. So in the case of, I think this as well as his fact sheet, just using houses. So showing like 2 out of 5 houses, this is a concern for instead of 23.47% makes it a little bit more digestible. The other thing to consider, and I think one of the things we spend a lot of time on is like, we want to raise concern enough that people feel motivated to test their water. But we don't want to be like all doom and gloom and have people think that there's nothing they can do. So making sure that we offer solutions, highlighting a problem, but offering solutions. And a lot of that had work to do on how to balance a tone. We don't want to scare people, but we do want people to be aware and know that this is something that they should be doing. And then also giving more information. Like I said, I would love to make this multiple pages long, have it be really comprehensive, but there was a lot of compromises to get this to be a short fact sheet that could be handed out at different events. And a couple unique examples I wanted to highlight. I think Vermont being such a small state, we knew certainly that we were going to distribute these at local health offices. That was definitely kind of the low-hanging fruit of where we would have these. But we also have a unique kind of community newsletter that goes out over email called Vermont Front Porch Forum. We got a lot of traction from that, kind of peer-to-peer, a place where we could put this and a lot of people in individual communities would see, because this was really a targeted outreach effort, so a little bit different than a lot of our state communication. And I think where the rubber really hit the road is when we started to do engagement with people in the community. So whether it was town health officers, which is a volunteer position in Vermont, town select boards, town clerks, I think that's where we really started to get buy-in from the community and get feedback on like what their concerns were with this messaging, you know, what could be done. That's where we really started to get ideas on kind of unique ways to engage with the community. One of those was with a community newsletter. I think this was in a town of, I think, 400 people. So it's a newsletter I don't think anyone outside of this town would have ever known exists. We were able to get kind of a blurb in there, and you know, it's something that was dropped off in everyone's mailbox. So that was a great use of something that we wouldn't have known about if it weren't for community partners. In one of the cases, we had our fact sheet in a town read at a town hall meeting. I'll talk a little bit more if that's like an effective way of outreach, but I thought it was kind of an interesting one that one of the councilmen felt so strongly that he was going to read it at a thing and make sure it was in the official minutes. Social media, I know this is definitely something we traditionally do a lot of work in. Again, with the issues with high-speed internet connections, we weren't sure if this was going to be super valuable, if we would gain a lot of traction this way or not. I'll talk a little bit about kind of a funny story about social media at the end here. And then one way that we did some engagement with the community is at a very unique Vermont holiday called Town Meeting Day, which is a time when really every municipality in the state, it's a state holiday, gets together, debates different issues, works on town budgets. That was really great because we knew it was going to be an area where people were congregating anyways, so working with those town health officers to really hand out flyers, spread the word about that this outreach was going on was super helpful. And I just wanted to highlight, it's still pretty early on, we're still working in a lot of these communities, but there was 4 I wanted to highlight where we had some early numbers back. One thing I definitely want to note is, you know, looking at the small population, all of these towns were under 1,000 people, most were under 5. But kind of starting from the top at Westmore, that was probably where we saw the least amount of change. We looked at the kind of 5-year average for how many tests people were doing per year and then breaking it up by quarter. This is the community where they kind of read the fact sheet at a town hall meeting, and that was the extent of outreach there. So we didn't see a big change by any means there. As we move down to like Ira, Wells, Hubbardton, we definitely did see a big impact following outreach. In the case of Ira, that was the place where there was a community newsletter. I think it was in the 2 or 3 weeks following that outreach around the holidays. They almost reached like the number of tests that they would do in a year. So we're definitely moving the needle a little bit there. Wells had kind of a higher testing rate already. That was where there was a known arsenic concern. So they were doing quite a bit more testing than most places given their size. But we did see definitely an impact from those community forums. And there was a lot of questions being asked that we were able to connect with and help answer people's questions. The big winner was definitely this kind of mountainous community in Hubbardton. We saw that they exceeded like the number of tests that they do in a year, like in a week within outreach. Kind of where we gained the most traction was maybe not how we had planned on. We were working with a town clerk, basically showing him an example of the fact sheet, seeing if there was any feedback they had, anything they wanted to include. And before we got it back from him, he had posted on his own like personal Facebook page. It was not something that was through like an official channel. And a lot of his friends were reacting, like it kind of caught wildfire. People were sharing it everywhere. So even though it wasn't maybe how we planned on doing that outreach, I think we got 9 tests, like all in one day and a lot of phone calls. So kind of like insider information, I think was why that was such an interesting piece for folks. But that was one that I thought was kind of interesting. It didn't go exactly as planned, but still got us where we wanted to be. Yeah, and I just kind of wanted to wrap up with some lessons learned. I think we had maybe not a rigid plan, but we had a pretty thorough plan of how we were going to engage with communities. I think the hope was that we were going to be able, not copy and paste, but kind of use the same model in each town. What we definitely found is that every town is very unique, so that definitely was something where we had to work in the community, find how people were getting information, and then work from there. I'll give a plug to Steve. I know he recently gave a talk on the private well class kind of about the 10-inch outreach, and I definitely found a lot of those things to be true, is that you have to be flexible, you have to get buy-in from the community, and sometimes that means changing your initial plans. Another thing that was really important was kind of balancing that messaging of not inducing fear, but prompting change. I think having a lot of eyes on it, talking to a lot of people, like, is this kind of the right message for folks? I think that was really helpful. And then when it comes to fact sheets, I think the hardest thing for me personally was making them super short. It's really important. Making sure it's easy to understand and accessible to a wide audience is really critical. And then I would say the biggest thing is also being open to feedback from the community. Sometimes it's criticism, sometimes it's little things to include. I feel like that's where we really got a lot of buy-in from these communities. So that was really important for us. And with that, I think I'm a little ahead of time, but I'm ready for questions. If there's any specific questions people have, definitely feel free to reach out directly. Yeah, let's see here. All right, first question, is the arsenic in Vermont's wells naturally occurring or a result of human activity? It's a good question. A lot of it is naturally occurring, and that's why we do see pockets. A lot of it's geologic based. I forget the exact strata it's located in, but there's kind of 2 pockets on either side of Vermont where it's naturally occurring in bedrock. So that is something that we see naturally occurring, not usually from industrial waste or anything like that. Let's see, next question. Does Vermont have well construction rules and regs, permitting requirements? Yeah, so we do have all of those things. I say one of the big factors is like most wells in use kind of predate a lot of those regulations. So there was kind of a wave of rules that happened in the 80s, the early 2000s, and then 2010s. So given a lot of the folks that we talk to are not permitted systems, they kind of predate those. So we definitely hear stories, my colleague and I, Christine, hear stories of systems that are just like open to the environment, or spring-fed systems that are just like very unique. I would say new wells being drilled like post 2019 is kind of when the last batch of testing requirements and certifications went through. Much more uniform compared to a lot of the folks that we work with. And let's see, was Town Meeting Day inspired at all by the show Parks and Rec? So I think Town Meeting Day probably predates it by about 300 years. So it is a very, very old-timey New England 1700s thing that is carried through, and it's usually met with, maple syrup and pancakes. So it's a very Vermont thing. Did anyone change certification requirements that require sharing data? Yeah, and this is something that we try to be really sensitive about, and something we considered with our maps of why, part of the reason statistics, but part of the reason we don't fill in maps that have less than 20 samples is to kind of protect that data. All water quality testing data in Vermont is technically a public record, so it can be FOIA'd. But it is something that we do try to not release, individualized point address water quality results unless we have to, or if it's like a property transfer, sometimes we'll do it then. But it is technically a public record. The oldest well you've seen, are hand-dug wells still common? Yeah, so hand-dug wells are still very common in Vermont, as are shallow bored wells. And one of the difficulties with that is like drilled wells, we have a pretty good idea via well logs where those are, but dug wells, hand-dug wells, springs, those are a lot harder to kind of track down. I think the oldest well of someone I talked to, was a hand-dug well, I think like right at the turn of the century. It was like 1905 that was still used. It was a shallow 20-foot hand-dug well. He has sent me some cool pictures of it, full of coliform. So that was something that we were trying to resolve. But there's definitely a lot of older systems still out there in Vermont. Can you give an example of a message that balances the urgency of action without undue alarm? Yeah, that's a tough one. I think one of the things that we try to do, especially when it comes to arsenic, just because there's a lot of awareness of things like PFAS, a lot of concern about man-made chemicals. One of the things we try and do is like talk about with arsenic, there are these health effects. There are increases risk of cancer. And we also explain that these are a lot of like chronic exposures. So knowing that like drinking it once, less of a concern than if you're drinking it for 40 years. But I think a lot of times when it comes to naturally occurring contaminants, kind of explaining where it comes from. I think when people see their test results, sometimes they think, oh, I'm not by a dump, like how did this happen? But just knowing that these things exist in nature and that the only way to really know if it's in your well is to test it. So that's kind of one of the balancing acts, is explaining where it comes from, knowing that there's this risk, but it's a long-term risk, and that even just being aware, changing what your water consumption practices is, putting in a filter, really has a long-term health benefit, is really how we do that messaging. When did the town meeting day, how did the residents respond to your outreach? What discussions and questions were asked? Yeah, it's a good question. So we kind of did this via proxy with our town health officers. It was definitely something that where they handed out quite a few flyers. I think particularly in the town of Wells is where I know this took place. And folks were generally like really informed. So I think Wells was unique. You saw the testing rate was a little higher there. I think there's kind of a known concern that arsenic's a problem. So I think what they were really happy about was to kind of have all that information in a condensed form, as we have a lot of websites, we have videos in different places where people can find it, but I think they really appreciated having just kind of a condensed handout with that information to like give to their parents or give to their neighbor that maybe isn't as concerned as that person was. Some of the questions that we had asked were definitely one of the kind of iterative changes that we made is like, is there a number we can call to like ask more questions about, like maybe people aren't as comfortable on our website. So that was one of the things that we did change, was like putting Christina and I's number right on the bottom and hoping that this didn't get too many people to call. But I think that was a really positive change, where people do like to have conversations over the phone. Great. Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you.